So I imagine that, reprogramming that child response, right, that you had when you were a child, and then reprogramming that as an adult has probably been like a huge part of your healing journey. Can you tell us about that?
Yeah. I do believe that the reprogramming started when I started doing my psychedelics. Like, that was a
Hmm.
huge change
Yeah.
for me. And also
Mhm.
meeting Gabor, and I say this in the book, him sort of bringing to my attention that my primary trauma was not my abuse, that my primary trauma was that I was cut off from adult support, which is how the abuse happened in the first place. And it
Mhm.
seems like a really simple thing,
Right.
but it was something that I never thought about, because I
Mhm.
think I wanted to protect my parents so much because they were all I had. And so really having to look at the whole system is something I think that a lot of survivors struggle with, right? Because
Mhm.
we blame the abuser, of course, because they're to blame, but you really need to look at the whole system and how that abuse was able to live in the system and how those things were able to happen to you. There were other adults around that didn't do anything about it.
Mhm.
And, I don't believe when you have abuse of the magnitude that I had, that everybody just didn't know.
Mhm. Right. And so you're saying that being cut off from the adult support is actually quite literally adults in your life looking the other way.
Yes. Yeah.
Right. Okay. Yeah. And that's
Yeah.
actually really profound as I'm thinking about it. I just wrote it down actually. The primary abuse was not actually the abuse that you were suffering, but it was actually that you were cut off from adult support. Like people looked away. That was the primary abuse. It's so
Yes.
interesting.
Because there's no safety net, right? So
Right.
in a healthy family, if I was abused, I would feel safe enough to go to my mom and say, "This just happened, like, this is not okay, this just happened," and it would have been validated and looked at, and I would have been taken out of the situation, and it would have been handled in a healthy way, and it
Right.
wasn't, and it never
Right.
was. And,
Right.
and I talk about this in the book, like, being at my grandfather's funeral and having one person after the other, all of his children go up there and speak about how he was the most amazing person in the world. And my one aunt said he was like Jesus Christ. And it's,
Wow.
you know, now in my adult space, I'm like, wow, the level of denial that they had to have had and the narrative that they had to have built around this family system in order to survive was massive.
Yeah. I'm just taking a breath because I just want to think about what you just said because it's actually really profound. I have a few family members who have been through something similar and I'm just thinking about their situations and this idea of the adults turning the other way. What's coming up for me as you're saying that is that, this also goes back to something I often talk about on this podcast, with healing that the basis of my work in Ayurveda is really reawakening the healer that's within. And that means tuning back into your intuition. And what
Yeah.
you're talking about is so much about other people also tuning into their intuition, that if they're sensing that there's something wrong in the family and they turn the other way, what's the result of that, right? And it also
Yeah.
dawns on me that perhaps, this is the pattern of intergenerational trauma, is the family pattern of turning away from an instinct, from an insight that you have. What do you think about
Mhm.
that?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, if my mom wasn't traumatized and my father wasn't traumatized, who
Mhm.
knows what my life would have looked like. I think it would have looked very different because I'm doing the work now. I have a daughter. I have
Right.
removed us from my entire family for that exact reason, because things started happening in the family system that were really unhealthy and not okay for
Mhm.
me. And it wasn't in the term, like, it wasn't in the level of sexual abuse, but it was other ways of abuse, gaslighting, narcissism, all the things
Right.
that we sort of happen to us when we're raised in this system, right? My mother's parents were
Mhm.
complete narcissists. Her father was a sociopath.
Yep.
I believe my grandmother was too. And so my mother grew up under that. And so how does that
Right.
how how does she show up as an adult if she
Mhm.
hasn't, you know, returned to herself, which is what I like to say, if she
Mhm.
hasn't found her authenticity. And that was a
Mhm.
big thing for me too, like the difference between attachment and authenticity, right? We have this attachment to our family and everybody has it, but are we able to be authentic in that attachment? And if we're not able to be authentic and we can't show up as ourselves to everybody, then we're not able to be ourselves and then we can never return to self, if that makes sense.
Mhm. Okay, so we have to unpack that because I'm
Yes.
thinking about what you're saying. It no, I mean it's really really important, and so I just want to go back to it. So you're saying that it was about attachment and being authentic. So can you walk us through that again? Because I think this is really important. It's not something that I necessarily would think about, and I really
Yeah.
want to learn from you. So can you explain that more for us, Kimberly?
Yeah, so I'm doing an event in October with Gabor in Santa Monica, and it's literally
Okay.
called Return to Self: Navigating Attachment and Authenticity. And
Okay.
those are the two things that he introduced to me as well that I never looked at.
Yeah.
And our attachment is our attachment to our parents. We're born being attached to our parents. And
Yes.
is it a healthy attachment or an unhealthy attachment? Right.
Okay.
So
Mhm.
in my case, it was an unhealthy attachment to both my parents and to my siblings too, because they were raised in the same system. So,
Mhm.
I think for years we all gaslit each other and there, everyone has some form of narcissism in my family. And what I realized when I wrote the book and when I sort of felt like I needed to ask everybody in my family for permission, like, is it okay that I'm going to tell my story? And
Mhm.
how they all showed up back to me, which, some just stopped talking to me. Some, it was like, you're going to ruin everyone's life if you write this book. And it really made me take a step back and realize that I wasn't able to be my authentic self in this family system because being my
Mhm.
authentic self is coming back to my truth, right? I need to speak my truth and I need to be validated by the people that were with me in this, that
Mhm.
the adults that didn't do anything, all of the people that are in this system. And if I need to show up differently, which is how I felt, like if I called
Right.
this sister or this aunt or this person, I had to be somebody else to everybody in order to
Wow.
make them comfortable.
Mhm.
So I
Mhm.
was never being my authentic self because it wasn't
Right.
accepted.
Right.
So it's the idea of coming back to yourself and being able to figure out who your authentic self is. And sometimes that can be really
Mhm.
hard when you've had so much trauma and it's so layered, but it became very important to me. And
Yeah.
I realized that I couldn't be the mother I wanted to be if I was not showing up as my authentic self. Because if
Mhm.
I'm telling my daughter to always tell the truth and to be true to yourself and to love
Sure.
yourself and you should be the first love of your life and all these things, and I'm not
Mhm.
emulating that,
Mhm.
she's going to follow what she sees, not what I tell her.
Yeah, and so what I'm thinking about is going back to something you talked about just earlier, a little while ago, is about this idea of truth telling, and that you,
Mm,
from a young age, were the truth teller in your family, and that to me sort of seems linked to this idea of being authentic. And so it almost seems to me, and again, I could be, please correct me if I'm wrong, is that your attempts to be a truth teller when you were younger was actually an attempt to be authentic,
yes.
right?
Yes,
Yeah.
absolutely.
Yeah, it's really
Yeah,
interesting.
and it
And
wasn't
so
it wasn't accepted.
right, it was just shut down all the time. And so, right, to make people feel comfortable, to not deal with the past, not to and maybe again for them to turn away from their own intuition and say it didn't, that's not what's going on sort of thing, right?
The thing that's interesting about my family is nobody ever said this didn't happen. This was not never something that anyone ever like disputed. Everyone was
Okay.
very because it happened to mostly everybody. Everyone was very aware of it, but I think what kept everyone where they were is that they weren't able to fully process it themselves and it was too uncomfortable and it was too painful for them. And so I like to say it's just like surviving, but it's not really
Mhm,
living, and
mhm.
it's really sad, and it just shows you how much pain one person can spread through a family.
Mhm. Yeah. Yeah, and then it's again, it's intergenerational. So it's like there's some source of it, and then it like just comes down through generations because it just because no one stops it or no one is willing to be that truth teller, right? Like you're trying to
Yes.
stop the intergenerational trauma, right?